Bruchim haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together Daf Ayin Aleph Amud Aleph, starting with Daf Ayin Amud Beis, 4 lines from the bottom. In general, during the Shalosh Regalim, a person is obligated to appear before HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the Beis HaMikdash, whereby there are 3 different korbanos that are brought. The first one is the Oila Re'iyah, the fact that he appears before HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the Beis HaMikdash. He can't come empty-handed. So he brings a korban oila called an oilas re'iyah. A second korban he brings is called a shalmei chagiga. That's lechatchila brought on the first day of the chag, and he can still bring it if he didn't bring it the first day throughout the rest of the chag. There's a second shlomim called a shalmei simcha, and that is brought in order to then eat meat during the course of the yontif to mekayim simchas hachag. Says the Gemara, Omar Ula, Omar Rabbi Elazar. Ula says in the name of Rabbi Elazar the following: Shlomim sheshachtam me'erev yontif eino yoytze behen. If a person shechs a korban shlomim on erev yontif, he cannot go ahead and mekayim his chiyuvim of both the shalmei simcha as well as the shalmei chagiga. Shlomim sheshachtam me'erev yontif eino yoytze behen lo mishum simcha v'lo mishum chagiga. Mishum simcha desriv. The reason why it's not going to be able to be a kiyum of shalmei simcha, because the following pasuk desriv, it states, I read you the pasuk: V'zavachta shlomim v'yachalta sham v'samachta lifnei Hashem Elokecha. Says Ul name Rabbi Elazar mishum desriv. By simcha it says v'zavachta v'samachta ba'inan zvicha b'shas simcha v'leka. Then that means when you are going to shech the korban shlomim for shalmei simcha, it has to be during Yom Tif. And since it's not during Yom Tif, if you shecht it on erev Yom Tif, you cannot mekayim your chiyuv of shalmei simcha with this shlomim. On top of ayin aleph amud aleph. Mishum chagiga havei davish shebechayva. The reason why you cannot mekayim your chiyuv with this shlomim for a korban shalmei chagiga is because, after all, it's something that is a choiv. And since you already were makdish this korban as a shlomim on erev chag, therefore you cannot go ahead and now use it for your choiv of shalmei chagiga. Says the Gemara, Messiah lei. Let us bring a support for what Ula said in Rabbi Elazar. V'hayisa ach sameach. It states v'hayisa ach sameach. Now Rabbi Elazar just told us that you cannot use the shlomim for your that was shechted on erev yontif for your shalmei simcha. So it says over here, v'hayisa ach sameach. This pasuk states in regards to sukkis, v'hayisa ach sameach. Now it already said previously in the prior psukim that for 7 days during sukkis that you shall rejoice, and now it states v'hayisa ach sameach, which seems to be superfluous. L'rabois le'le yomtiv ha'achron l'simcha. This comes, the words vayisa ach sameach, and shall only have joy, should come now and to include the 8th night, the hainu, the night of Shmini Atzeres, for simcha. Ata oimer le'le yomtiv ha'achron eino ela le'le yomtiv harishan. The Brisa goes on to say, maybe this comes instead to include the first night of Yom Tif, whereby in order to then have the meat for the first night of Yom Tif, since you cannot shecht the korban during the night, it must be that you shechted it on erev Yom Tif, and that was a shlomim. So you might think that indeed what Rabbi Elazar is saying is not true. Says the Brisa, Talmud loymar ach chilek. Therefore, it says ach to me say chilek to tell you that there's a restrictive repurpose over here, that it's davka the 8th night to the exclusion of the first night. Why should it only include the 8th night and not the first night? My taimo la mishum de ein loy bamei yismach. Is it not because you have nothing to rejoice with the first night? Another, the expression of the joy of ach sameach, of simchas hachag, is ayidei, the meat of the shalmei simcha. So therefore, maybe because you don't have the meat for the first night, therefore you cannot go ahead and mekayim that, since you didn't bring you don't have a korban, and therefore we would have a proof that would seem to be against Rabbi Ula and the name Rabbi Elazar. The Gemara says, Lo, kidetani taima. Because like the Bryce itself says the reason. Ma ra'isa l'rabos leil yomtiv ha'acharoin u'loitzi yomtiv rishon. Where do I know to include the last night, Nahainu, the 8th night of Shmini Atzeres, that there's a chiyuv to eat the meat of the Shalmei Simcha, and not to include the first night? Merabe ani leil yomtiv ha'acharoin sheyesh simcha lefonav. The reason why we come to include the 8th night and not the first night is because the 8th night follows all of the 7 days of Sukkot, where there's a chiyuv to eat the Shalmei Simcha. So therefore, the continuation of that would be the 8th night, a hemshich of the 7 days of Simchas HaChag. Whereas it would be a bigger chiddush to say that the first night would be required, which we don't have any Simcha before it. So therefore, it's more mistaber to include the 8th night than the first night. Mosiv Rav Yosef. Now Rav Yosef asks from a brisa on Reb Ula named Rabbi Elazar. Again, Ula named Rabbi Elazar said you cannot use a shlomim that was shechted on Erev Yontif for your Shalmei Simcha on Yontif. Says Rav Yosef to ask, Chagigos arba'asar yotzei ba mishum simcha vein yotzei mishum chagiga. The chagiga of the 14th, that can be used, he says, for your Shalmei Simcha, but for not for your Shalmei Chagiga. Amai asked the Gemara, why not? Is it not because you need to then require that the slaughtering be done in time of the Simcha, of the Yom Tif, and you don't have that? And therefore, Lechara, here it's saying that the Chagiga that is done on the 14th can be used for the Shalmei Simcha. So here we have a kasha from this brisa on what Ula said in Rabbi Elazar. He's saying that you could not do it because you could not shech the shlamim for the Shalmei Simcha. And here the brisa seems to say exactly the opposite. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Idi bar Avin she'ike v'shachta. No, this brisa is talking about where he didn't shech the Shalmei Chagiga, the Yudalid, on Yudalid. He waited and shechted it only on Tes Vav. So that which he shechted on Tes Vav could be used for Shalmei Simcha. Since Shalmei Simcha is to eat that from a korban, so even though it wasn't designated Shalmei Simcha, that korban Chagiga of Yudal, which is only shechted on Tes Vav, can be used for Shalmei Simcha. Rav Ashi says it's mistaber to say that the Bryce is talking about such a situation where he intended to then shech the korban chagiga of Yudalid on Yudalid, but he didn't get a chance to do so, and instead he shechted it on Tesvav. It can be now used for Shalmei Simcha, says the Bryce. If you don't say that this is the case, this Bryce, who is the one who taught this Bryce, which was quoted earlier? Ben Tema, it's Ben Tema. And Ben Tema, Hapasla Labelina. His shita is that the Shalmei Chagiga of Yudalid has the same din as the Korban Pesach. Just as the Korban Pesach cannot be left overnight, it can only be in that first night. So too, the Chagiga of Yudalid can only be in that night. So therefore, it's mistaber, just like we said in the Brisa. Shmamina, that indeed, this must be the case that we're talking about in this brisa, that again, he didn't shecht it on Yudalid, rather he shecht it on Tesvav, and he's using the meat to be consumed for Shalmei Simcha. Mosiv Rava asks from a brisa on the same premise, again, that Ula said, named Rabbi Elazar, that a Shalmei Chagiga, a shlamim that was shechted on Erev Yontav cannot be used for Shalmei Simcha. Ha-halil v'asimcha shmoina. It states in the Mishnah in Sukkah that Hallel is stated for 8 days, all 8 days, the 7 days of Sukkot, as well as the 8th day of Shmini Atzeres, and Simcha, which is the expression of Simcha, which is the Shalmei Simcha, eating the meat of the Shalmei Simcha. So we see that's the 8 days, is the Mishnah. And if you're going to say that you require that the korban be shechted during Yom Tif, the then we'll find cases where you can only have 7 days of simcha. When the first day of Yom Tov comes out to be on Shabbos, you cannot shecht the carbon, and therefore, since you can't shecht the carbon, because it's not doiche Shabbos, the carbon chagiga, the carbon of Shalmei Simcha, therefore, you only have 7 days of rejoicing. So why does the Mishnah state emphatically that there are 8 days for Hallel and 8 days for Simcha? Indeed, you would only have 7 days. So this would be a kasha on, again, Ula and Rabbi Elazar, because only according to Ula and Rabbi Elazar could you not shech the shlamim on Erev Chag for the first night of Chag. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Huna Bereid Rav Yehuda Misamchoy Besirei Haragolim. He says that you can eat from the Seirim. There's a Sir Chatas that is brought on the first day of Yom Tov. So therefore you can go ahead and rejoice by the first day of Yom Tov by eating that meat of the Chatos that the Kohanim will eat. Omar Rava says that's a problem for 2 reasons. Shtei Teshuvas Badavar. 2 reasons why this is not going to be a viable way of explaining the Brisa. Chada, first of all, Desirei Haragolim Chai Necholim. First of all, even if they're going to eat the Seirim, but it can't be cooked, it can't be roasted, because that would be a Chilul Shabbos. It's permissible to them to bring it as a carbon, but to then cook it afterwards, not. So therefore it would have to be eaten raw, since it's Shabbos. Tzli ein necholin, but it couldn't be eaten roasted. V'simchas chag b'chai leko, and therefore you're not going to be able to kayim simchas hachag ayidei eating raw meat if it's not going to be cooked, and therefore it's not going to be a valid form of being mekayim simcha. That's 1. 2 says Rava v'od kahanim oichlin v'Yisrael b'mes mechim. Even if you want to say they're going to mekayim their mitzvah of simcha ayidei da'achila, but who's eating this? Since it's a chatas, it's only going to be the kohanim that are eating this, but the rest of Klal Yisrael are not going to be able to mekayim simchas hachag with this. Elam Rav Papa, rather Rav Papa says, why does it say there's 8 days of simcha, including the Shmini Atzeres? Misamchoy biksus nekiya v'yayin yoshan. You can mekayim the chiyuv of simcha. When you can't mekayim it with the basar, you can mekayim with ksus nekiya, with clean clothing, and as well as yayin yoshan, aged wine. So therefore, that's already a kiyum of the simcha. Now the Gemara records another version in the name of Rabbi Elazar. This time, the exact opposite din. Kiyasa Ravina Rabbi Elazar. Now, instead of Ula saying in Rabbi Elazar that the shlamim that was sacrificed before Yom Tov cannot be used as a shalmei simcha for Yom Tov, here Ravin says in the name of Rabbi Elazar the opposite. Shlamim sheshachton me'erev Yom Tov yoytze behem mishum simcha ve'yoytze behem mishum chagiga. He says when it comes to chagiga, I agree with you, it cannot be used for the chagiga, the carbon chagiga, shalmei chagiga. But, however, it could be used for shalmei simcha. Yoytze mishum simcha, you could use it for simcha, for the shalmei simcha, because lo ba'inin zvicha b'shas micha. He says you do not require that it be shechted during the Yom Tov. V'loy mishum chagiga, and he agrees again with what Ula said in Rabbi Elazar, that the carbon chagiga cannot be a fulfillment with this shlamim, because the shlamim was already consecrated as a carbon shlamim before Yom Tiv. You cannot now use something that's consecrated for that which is a choivo, and since the shalmei chagiga is a choiv, it's not going to be valid. Now ask the Gemara Meisvei, on that which Ravina says, Rabbi Elazar, that you could, yes, use your shlamim that was shechted on the Erev Yom Tov for Shalmei Simcha. V'hayisa ach sameach. Behold, it says in the Pasuk, V'hayisa ach sameach. And again, that seems to be superfluous. It already stated during Sukkot you're to rejoice for 7 days. Why does it add V'hayisa ach sameach? L'rabos le'le Yom Tov ha'achron l'simcha. The Brisa says to include the 8th night for Simcha, dahainu, Shalmei Simcha, to eat the meat of the Shalmei Simcha. Is it coming to add the 8th night, or maybe the 1st night? Asked the Brisa. Therefore, it says to qualify and say Davka only the 8th night. My taimo, why did we choose to include the 8th night and not the first night? Lav mishum de'ein loy b'mei yismach. Is it not because there is nothing to then rejoice with? There's no meat to rejoice with on the first night. Because after all, the only way to rejoice with the meat on the first night is to have shechted the korban shlomim on erev yontiv. You can't shech the korban at night. So it must be that you can shech it on erev yontiv. The fact that it's not going to be a viable option is the reason why you cannot go ahead and include the first night for simcha. So this would be a kasha on the way Ravin is explaining Rabbi Elazar. Says the Gemara, Lo, Kidetanya, like the Brisa states, what's the reason why we include the 8th night for Simcha Sachag to eat from the Shalmei Simcha instead of the first night? Not like you thought, because you can't shech on Erev Yantif a shlamim for your simchas, shlamim for your shlamim for the first night, because for a different reason. Marbani lele yantiv ha'achon sheyish simcha lefonov. Umoitziani lele yantiv harishon she'ein simcha lefonov. I include the 8th night because it's a hemshech of the first 7 days of simcha of Sukkos. So therefore, it comes to be then including the 8th night of Shmini Atzeres. Whereas the first night, that would be a bigger chiddush. The first night, there's nothing preceding it to then say that it's a hemshech of simcha. So therefore, it's more mistaber to include the 8th night than the first night. So it comes out that we have two different versions of Rabbi Elazar. The first version, again, was Ula's version, and that was you cannot shech the korban shlamim on Erev Yantif for your Shalmei Simcha for Yantif. And on the other hand, we have Ravin who's saying that Rabbi Elazar the opposite. You could, yes, shech your korban shlamim on Erev Yantif for your Shalmei Simcha.